The dust kicked up behind Jake's worn boots as he walked toward the massive iron gates of the Blackwood Ranch. The letter in his back pocket felt heavier than the saddle he'd been carrying for the past 3 days. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood had summoned him, and, when the richest woman in 3 counties called, a drifter like Jake didn't have much choice but to answer. The ranch stretched as far as his eyes could see. Thousands of acres of prime cattle land, with more head of beef than most towns had people. The main house sat like a castle on a hill, its white columns gleaming in the afternoon sun. Jake had heard stories about this place his whole life, but seeing it up close made his stomach twist with something between awe and unease. Eleanor Blackwood was waiting for him on the front porch, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, her black dress making her look like a judge ready to pass sentence. She was 73 years old, but her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone half her age. Jake had never met her before, but he knew her reputation. She'd built this empire from nothing after her husband died 20 years ago, and she didn't suffer fools or weakness. "You must be Jake Morrison," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "You look just like your father." Jake stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, his hat in his hands. "Ma'am, I think there might be some mistake. My father was just a ranch hand. Died when I was 12. Eleanor's thin lips curved into something that might have been a smile. "Thomas Morrison worked for my late husband for 15 years. He was more than just a ranch hand, boy. He was family." The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. His father had never mentioned working for the Blackwoods. All Jake knew was that Thomas Morrison had been a quiet man who smelled of leather and horses, who taught his son to ride and wrote before a bad fall from a bronco had taken his life. "I don't understand," Jake said, his voice rougher than he intended. Eleanor stood up, her cane tapping against the wooden floor. "Come inside, boy. We have much to discuss." The inside of the house was even more impressive than the outside. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings, and oil paintings of stern-faced men in cowboy hats lined the walls. Jake felt out of place in his dusty clothes and scuffed boots, but Eleanor seemed to pay no attention to his appearance. She led him to a study lined with leather-bound books and filled with the smell of tobacco and old paper. Behind a massive oak desk sat more papers than Jake had ever seen in one place, along with ledgers that looked thick enough to stop bullets. "Sit," Eleanor commanded, settling behind her desk like a queen on her throne. Jake sat in the chair across from her, his hat balanced on his knee. "Mrs. Blackwood, I appreciate you seeing me, but I'm not sure why I'm here." Eleanor opened a drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder. "You're here because you're the last Morrison, and the Morrisons have always had a place on this ranch." She opened the folder and spread several documents across the desk. "Your father owned 10% of this operation, Jake. When he died, that ownership should have passed to you." The room seemed to spin around Jake. "That's impossible. My father was broke when he died. We lost our little cabin to the bank. I've been drifting ever since, working whatever jobs I could find." "Your father made some poor investments in his later years," Eleanor said, her voice gentler now. "But his partnership in this ranch was protected. I've been looking for you for 3 years, ever since my lawyers finally tracked down all the paperwork." Jake stared at the documents spread across the desk, but the words seemed to swim before his eyes. Legal language he didn't understand, numbers that made no sense, and his father's signature on papers he'd never known existed. 10% of this ranch," Eleanor continued, "makes you a very wealthy man, Jake Morrison. But wealth comes with responsibility." "What kind of responsibility?" Jake asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, studying him with those sharp eyes. "I'm 73 years old, and I have no children. My husband's nephews are circling like vultures, waiting for me to die so they can sell this place to developers. They see dollar signs where I see legacy." She stood up and walked to the window that looked out over the sprawling ranch. "I've spent my entire adult life building this place into something special. The Blackwood Ranch employs 200 families. We support 3 small towns. We're the biggest supplier of beef to the military in this part of the country. This isn't just a business, Jake. It's a way of life. Jake joined her at the window, watching cowboys herding cattle in the distance. "What does this have to do with me?" "I need an heir," Eleanor said simply. "Someone who understands this land, who respects what it means. Someone with Morrison blood." The implications of her words hit Jake like a thunderbolt. "You want me to take over the ranch?" "I want you to earn the right to take over the ranch," Eleanor corrected. "Your 10% ownership gives you a seat at the table, but running this operation requires more than just owning a piece of it. You'll need to prove yourself." Jake turned to face her, seeing something in her expression he hadn't noticed before. Desperation, maybe, or just the weight of too many years carrying too much responsibility alone. "What if I'm not cut out for this?" he asked. "I've never managed anything bigger than a string of horses." Eleanor's smile was genuine this time. "Your father said the same thing when my husband first made him a partner. But Thomas Morrison had something you can't teach. He had the heart of a cowboy and the soul of a leader. I believe his son inherited both." She walked back to her desk and picked up a key from among the papers. "There's a foreman's house about 2 miles south of here. It's been empty since my last foreman retired. You can stay there while you learn the operation." Jake took the key, feeling its weight in his palm. "And if I fail?" "Then, you keep your 10% and find someone worthy to buy you out," Eleanor said. "But I don't think you'll fail, Jake Morrison. Your father never backed down from a challenge, and I suspect his son won't either." As Jake left the big house, his mind reeled with everything that had happened in the past hour. This morning he'd been a drifter with $37 in his pocket and no prospects beyond the next town. Now he was a partial owner of one of the biggest ranches in the state, with a chance to inherit the whole operation. The foreman's house was smaller than the main house but larger than anywhere Jake had lived since his father died. It was fully furnished and cleaner than most hotels he'd stayed in. As he sat on the front porch watching the sun set over land that was partly his, Jake felt the weight of possibility settling on his shoulders. He thought about his father, trying to remember if there had been any signs that Thomas Morrison was more than just another ranch hand. But all Jake could recall was a quiet man who'd loved horses and had always seemed sad about something he never talked about. Tomorrow, Jake would start learning what it meant to run a cattle operation this size. He'd meet the cowboys who worked the land, the accountants who managed the money, and the buyers who purchased the beef. He'd have to prove himself worthy of Eleanor Blackwood's trust and his father's legacy. But tonight, sitting on his own front porch for the first time in 15 years, Jake Morrison allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he'd finally found where he belonged. Jake's first morning on the Blackwood Ranch began before sunrise with the sound of horses and men preparing for the day's work. He'd barely slept, his mind churning with questions about his father, the ranch, and what Eleanor Blackwood really expected from him. He dressed quickly and walked toward the main barn, where he could see lanterns burning and hear the low voices of cowboys discussing the day ahead. As he approached, the conversations died down, and Jake felt a dozen pairs of eyes studying him with the kind of suspicion reserved for outsiders. "You must be the new owner," said a gruff voice from the shadows. A man stepped forward, tall and lean with gray stubble and eyes that had seen too many hard years. "I'm Roy Hensley, ranch foreman. Been running the day-to-day operations here for 12 years. Jake extended his hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. "Jake Morrison. I guess I have a lot to learn." Roy's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "Morrison. I worked with your daddy. Good man. Knew cattle and horses better than most, but he had ideas that didn't always sit well with the old boss." "What kind of ideas?" Jake asked. Before Roy could answer, another voice cut through the morning air. "The kind of ideas that cost money and make life easier for cattle instead of profit margins." Jake turned to see a woman walking toward them, her blonde hair pulled back under a worn cowboy hat, her jeans and boots showing the kind of wear that came from real work, not fashion. She was probably 30, with green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once and a smile that suggested she found something amusing about the situation. "This is Sarah Mitchell," Roy said. "Best horse trainer in 3 counties and the only person on this ranch who's not afraid to tell Mrs. Blackwood when she's wrong." Sarah extended her hand to Jake, her grip as firm as Roy's. "Your father used to say that happy cattle make better beef. He wanted to expand the grazing rotation, improve the water systems, and stop using some of the harsher methods for breaking horses." "And Mrs. Blackwood disagreed?" Jake asked. "Mrs. Blackwood's husband disagreed," Sarah corrected. Eleanor was always more open to new ideas, but she was also trying to keep peace between her husband and your father. Roy spat into the dust. "Your daddy left after a big argument with the old man. Said he'd rather break his back working for wages than compromise his principles for partnership money." The pieces of Jake's father's life were starting to fit together in ways that painted a different picture than the quiet, defeated man Jake remembered. "So he walked away from his 10%? "He tried to," Roy said. "But the partnership agreement was ironclad. Your daddy was stuck with his share whether he wanted it or not." Sarah pulled a piece of paper from her shirt pocket and handed it to Jake. "Mrs. Blackwood asked me to give you this. It's today's schedule. She wants you to see every part of the operation before you make any decisions about your future here." Jake looked at the schedule, noting that it started with the cattle operation at dawn and ended with a business meeting at sunset. "Looks like a full day." "Every day's a full day on a ranch this size," Roy said. "Question is whether you're ready for it." The challenge in Roy's voice was clear, and Jake realized this was his first test. The ranch hands were watching to see if he was just another city boy playing cowboy or if he had the backbone to earn their respect. "Let's find out," Jake said, folding the schedule and putting it in his pocket. The next 12 hours taught Jake more about the cattle business than he'd learned in his entire life. Roy took him through the grazing areas, explaining how different sections of the ranch were used throughout the year to maintain the grass and provide the best nutrition for the cattle. "Your daddy wanted to add 2 more sections to the rotation," Roy explained as they rode across a particularly lush pasture. "Would have meant better grass recovery and healthier cattle, but it also would have meant more fencing and water lines." Jake studied the layout of the land, seeing how his father's idea would work. "Seems like it would pay for itself in better beef prices." "That's what your daddy said." But the old man was more interested in immediate profits than long-term improvements. They visited the breeding operation, where Sarah showed Jake the horses used for ranch work and the system for training them. Her methods were gentler than what Jake had seen on other ranches, based on trust and patience rather than breaking the animal's spirits. "Your father helped me develop this approach," Sarah said as she worked with a young mare that had never been ridden. "He believed that animals that trust their handlers work better and live longer." Jake watched Sarah guide the horse through basic exercises, noting how the animal responded to her calm voice and steady movements. "Makes sense. A horse that's afraid of you is always going to be unpredictable." "Exactly. But it takes longer than the old methods, and time is money in this business." Throughout the day, Jake began to understand the tension his father had faced. Every improvement, every innovation, every attempt to treat the animals and land better came with a cost that had to be justified to owners who were focused on quarterly profits rather than generational sustainability. In the afternoon, Roy took him to meet the ranch's accountant, a sharp-eyed woman named Martha who'd been keeping the books for 8 years. She spread out ledgers and computer printouts that told the story of the ranch's finances in stark numbers. "We're profitable," Martha said, "but we're not growing like we should be. Mrs. Blackwood's been conservative about reinvestment, partly because she's been waiting to see what happens when she's gone." Jake studied the numbers, seeing patterns that reflected the larger issues Roy and Sarah had described. "What would happen if we implemented the improvements my father wanted?" Martha pulled out a different set of papers. "I actually ran those projections a few years ago when Mrs. Blackwood asked me to review his proposals. Initial cost would be significant, but the long-term benefits would increase ranch value by at least 30%. "Then, why didn't she do it?" "Because she's 73 years old and wasn't sure she'd live to see the payoff," Martha said bluntly. "Also because she wasn't sure who would inherit the ranch and whether they'd understand the vision behind the investment." As the sun began to set, Jake found himself back at the main house, sitting across from Eleanor Blackwood in the same study where his life had changed 24 hours earlier. She looked as composed as ever, but he could see the question in her eyes. "Well," she said simply. Jake leaned back in his chair, thinking about everything he'd seen and learned. "This ranch is successful, but it could be extraordinary. My father saw that 20 years ago, and the opportunity is still there." Eleanor nodded slowly. "And are you prepared to make those improvements?" "If you're prepared to trust me with the authority to do it," Jake replied. "But I'd need to know that you're committed to the long-term vision, not just looking for someone to maintain the status quo until you're gone." For the first time since he'd met her, Eleanor Blackwood smiled with genuine warmth. "Your father would be proud to hear you say that. He always said the land would outlast all of us, and our job was to leave it better than we found it." She opened her desk drawer and pulled out another document. "This is a contract that would make you ranch manager with full operational authority. Your salary would be substantial, and your 10% ownership gives you a significant stake in the ranch's success." Jake looked at the contract but didn't pick it up. "What about when you're gone? What happens to the ranch then?" Eleanor's expression grew serious. "That depends on what you prove yourself capable of, Jake Morrison. But I'll tell you this much. My husband's nephews will inherit over my dead body. This ranch needs someone who understands that it's more than just a business. It's a responsibility to the land, the animals, and the people whose lives depend on it." Jake picked up the contract and scanned its contents. The salary was more than he'd ever imagined earning, and the authority was real. He'd be able to implement his father's vision and prove himself worthy of Eleanor's trust. But he could also see the weight of that responsibility. 200 families depended on the ranch for their livelihood. 3 small towns relied on it for economic stability. And somewhere in his future, the possibility existed that he might inherit not just a business, but a legacy that stretched back generations. "I'll need Roy and Sarah to support the changes," Jake said finally. "They already do," Eleanor replied. "They've been waiting 20 years for someone with the authority to implement your father's ideas." Jake signed the contract, feeling the pen heavy in his hand. Tomorrow he would begin the real work of proving himself worthy of the trust Eleanor Blackwood had placed in him. Outside the study windows, the ranch settled into evening quiet, but Jake could feel the pulse of the operation that would now be his responsibility. Somewhere in that vast expanse of land and cattle, his father's dream was waiting to be fulfilled. 3 months into his role as ranch manager, Jake had learned that running the Blackwood Ranch was like conducting an orchestra where half the musicians spoke only in cattle prices and weather reports. Every decision rippled through the operation in ways he was still discovering, and every mistake could cost thousands of dollars or, worse, the respect of the men and women who trusted him with their livelihoods. The first major test came when a late spring storm damaged the main water line that fed the eastern grazing sections. The repair would cost $60,000, money that wasn't in the quarterly budget. But, without the water line, they'd have to move 800 head of cattle to already crowded pastures, which would stress the animals and damage the grass recovery Eleanor was counting on. Jake stood in the mud beside the broken pipeline, rain still dripping from his hat brim, while Roy and 2 other cowboys waited for his decision. This was exactly the kind of situation where his inexperience showed, where the gap between understanding the theory of ranch management and actually living it became painfully clear. "What would your father have done?" Roy asked, and Jake could hear genuine curiosity in the question rather than challenge. Jake thought about the stories he'd been hearing about Thomas Morrison over the past few months. His father had been a man who thought 10 steps ahead, who understood that short-term savings often led to long-term disasters. "He would have fixed the line," Jake said finally. "And found a way to pay for it later." Roy nodded and signaled to his crew to start the repair work. "That's what I figured. Your daddy always said cattle can survive a lot of things, but they can't survive being thirsty." The repair ate up most of the ranch's emergency fund, but it also earned Jake something more valuable than money. That evening, as word spread through the ranch about his decision, Jake noticed a change in the way the cowboys looked at him. The suspicion was being replaced by something that might eventually become respect. Sarah found him that night sitting on his front porch, going through ledgers by lamplight, trying to figure out how to absorb the unexpected expense without cutting into essential operations. You know, there are electric lights inside the house, she said, settling into the chair beside him. Jake looked up from the numbers that had been blurring together for the past hour. Sometimes I think better out here. Helps me remember what all these numbers actually represent. Sarah was quiet for a moment, then said, "The men are talking about what you did today. Most of them figured you'd choose the cheaper option, move the cattle and hope for the best." "Would that have been so wrong?" Jake asked. "No, it would have been practical. But it also would have been short-sighted, and the Cowboys know the difference." Sarah shifted in her chair to face him. "Your father used to sit on this same porch, going through the same kinds of problems. He said the hardest part of ranching wasn't the physical work, it was making decisions when you only had partial information and no perfect choices." Jake closed the ledger and leaned back, feeling the weight of the day settling into his bones. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm in over my head. 3 months ago I was sleeping in bunkhouses and living paycheck to paycheck. Now I'm responsible for an operation worth millions of dollars." "Eleanor wouldn't have chosen you if she didn't believe you could handle it," Sarah said. "But believing in someone and watching them succeed are two different things." The next few weeks brought a series of smaller challenges that tested Jake's growing understanding of the ranch's complexities. A dispute between two longtime cowboys over work assignments required diplomatic skills he was still developing. A potential buyer's complaint about beef quality led to a review of the feeding program that revealed problems with one of their grain suppliers. A state inspector's visit resulted in recommendations for equipment upgrades that would cost more than Jake wanted to spend but less than he could afford to ignore. Each problem taught him something new about the delicate balance required to keep the operation running smoothly. But, more importantly, each successful resolution built his confidence and strengthened his relationships with the people who made the ranch work. The breakthrough came on a hot July morning when Jake was reviewing the quarterly reports with Martha, the ranch accountant. Despite the unexpected expense of the waterline repair, the ranch was showing its best profit margins in 3 years. "How is that possible?" Jake asked, staring at numbers that seemed too good to be true. Martha smiled, something she didn't do often. "Better grass management has improved the cattle's weight gain. The new horse training methods are reducing veterinary costs. And the equipment maintenance program you implemented has prevented 3 major breakdowns that would have cost us a fortune in emergency repairs." Jake realized he'd been unconsciously implementing his father's vision, making decisions based on long-term thinking rather than short-term profits. The improvements were small individually, but together they were transforming the operation in exactly the way Thomas Morrison had envisioned 20 years earlier. That evening, Eleanor summoned him to the main house for what had become their weekly business meeting. But, this time, she was waiting for him in the dining room rather than the study, with a meal laid out for 2 and a bottle of wine that probably cost more than Jake used to make in a month. "We're celebrating," Eleanor announced as he sat down across from her. "What are we celebrating?" Jake asked, though he suspected he knew. Eleanor raised her wineglass in a toast. "We're celebrating the fact that you've stopped thinking like a hired hand and started thinking like an owner." The meal was the finest Jake had ever eaten, and the conversation ranged from ranch business to family history to Eleanor's memories of the early days when she and her husband were building their empire from scratch. For the first time since he'd arrived, Jake felt like he was talking to Eleanor Blackwood the person rather than Eleanor Blackwood the ranch owner. "I need to tell you something," Eleanor said as they finished dessert. "My lawyers have been pressuring me to finalize my will, and my husband's nephews have been making increasingly aggressive overtures about buying out my interest in the ranch." Jake felt his stomach tighten. "What kind of overtures?" "The kind that come with threats if I don't cooperate," Eleanor said calmly. "They've made it clear that they believe the ranch should stay in the family, and they don't consider a hired hand, even one with Morrison blood, to be family." The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. "Are you selling to them?" Eleanor's laugh was sharp and humorless. "I'd burn this place to the ground before I'd let those vultures get their hands on it. But their pressure has forced me to make some decisions about the future." She reached into her purse and pulled out a legal document that looked similar to the contracts Jake had signed when he first arrived. "This is an updated partnership agreement. If you sign it, your ownership stake increases to 49%, with an option to purchase my remaining 51% when I die. Jake stared at the document, his mind racing. 49%? That's enough to give you control of the day-to-day operations and enough value to make you a very wealthy man, Eleanor finished. It's also enough to give my husband's nephews a very good reason to see you as a threat rather than just an inconvenience. The weight of her words settled over Jake like a storm cloud. He was being offered something beyond his wildest dreams, but it came with dangers he was only beginning to understand. What happens if I say no? He asked. Eleanor's expression grew sad. Then, I sell the ranch to the highest bidder, probably a development company that will turn it into shopping centers and housing subdivisions. The Cowboys lose their jobs, the towns lose their economic foundation, and everything your father and I worked to build disappears forever. Jake picked up the contract, reading through terms that would change his life in ways he was still trying to comprehend. The financial provisions were generous beyond belief, but the real value was in the opportunity to preserve something important, something worth more than money. There's one more thing, Eleanor said quietly. If you sign this agreement, you'll need to be prepared to fight for what's yours. My husband's nephews won't give up easily, and they have resources and connections that could make your life very difficult. Jake looked across the table at the woman who had given him a chance to fulfill his father's dreams and build something lasting. Eleanor Blackwood was 73 years old, but her eyes still burned with the fire of someone who refused to be defeated by age or circumstance. My father walked away from a fight once, Jake said finally. I won't make the same mistake. He signed the contract, knowing that he was crossing a line from which there would be no return. Tomorrow he would wake up as a near-equal partner in one of the largest ranches in the state, with all the opportunities and responsibilities that came with that position. But tonight, sitting in the elegant dining room of the Blackwood Ranch, Jake Morrison felt the weight of his father's legacy settling on his shoulders like a mantle he was finally ready to wear. The trouble started 6 weeks after Jake signed the new partnership agreement, on a crisp October morning that began like any other but ended with everything changed. He was reviewing breeding records in the ranch office when Roy burst through the door, his face grim and his clothes covered with dust. We've got problems, Roy said without preamble. Big problems. Jake looked up from the paperwork, immediately alert. In the months he'd worked with Roy, the foreman had never shown panic, even in the worst situations. What kind of problems? The kind that wear expensive suits and carry legal papers, Roy replied. 3 men just served me with some kind of court order saying we have to allow them access to all ranch records for a financial audit. Jake's blood turned cold. Eleanor's nephews? 2 of them, plus a lawyer who looks like he eats nails for breakfast. They're at the main house right now, and Mrs. Blackwood asked me to get you up there immediately. Jake grabbed his hat and followed Roy to the main house, his mind racing through the implications. He'd known that Eleanor's husband's nephews would eventually make their move, but he'd hoped to have more time to prepare. The scene at the main house was tense and ugly. Eleanor stood on the front porch, her back ramrod straight and her chin raised in defiance, while 3 men in expensive suits waited beside a black Mercedes that looked completely out of place on the ranch. The tallest of the 3 men stepped forward as Jake and Roy approached. He was about 50, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. You must be Jake Morrison. I'm Richard Blackwood, Eleanor's nephew-in-law. This is my brother David, and our attorney, Mr. Stevens. Jake didn't extend his hand. What can I do for you gentlemen? Richard's smile widened, becoming even less pleasant. We're here to conduct a court-ordered audit of the ranch's financial records. We have reason to believe there have been irregularities in the management of family assets. What kind of irregularities? Jake asked, though he could already guess where this was heading. The lawyer, Stevens, spoke for the first time. His voice was smooth and professional, the kind that could make threats sound like friendly conversation. We've received reports that ranch funds have been misused for unauthorized capital improvements, that partnership agreements have been altered without proper oversight, and that certain individuals have been granted ownership stakes through questionable means. Eleanor's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. There have been no irregularities, and you know it. This is nothing more than harassment designed to pressure me into selling. David Blackwood spoke up, his voice carrying a tone of fake concern. Aunt Eleanor, we're only looking out for your best interests. You're 73 years old, and managing an operation this complex is obviously becoming too much for you. The ranch is more profitable now than it's been in 5 years, Eleanor replied coldly. Under the guidance of a drifter with no business experience and questionable family connections, Richard said, his eyes fixed on Jake. We've done some research on Mr. Morrison, and his background raises some interesting questions. Jake felt anger building in his chest, but he kept his voice level. What kind of questions? Stevens opened a briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. Questions about your father's departure from this ranch 20 years ago. Questions about debts you accumulated during your years of drifting from job to job. Questions about whether your recent partnership agreement might constitute fraud against the Blackwood estate. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Jake realized this wasn't just about money or inheritance. This was about destroying his credibility and painting him as a fortune hunter who'd manipulated an elderly woman for his own benefit. My partnership agreement is completely legal and was approved by Eleanor's own lawyers, Jake said. Eleanor's current lawyers, Stevens corrected. We've already petitioned the court to appoint independent counsel to review all recent legal documents related to the ranch. Eleanor stepped forward, her cane tapping sharply against the porch boards. You have your court order, so conduct your audit. But you'll find nothing because there's nothing improper to find. Richard's smile became genuinely pleased. Oh, I'm sure we'll find exactly what we're looking for, Aunt Eleanor. The next 3 days were a nightmare of scrutiny and intimidation. Stevens and a team of forensic accountants went through every financial record the ranch had produced in the past 2 years. They questioned employees about Jake's management decisions, implying that he'd been reckless with money and resources. Jake watched his carefully built relationships with the ranch hands beginning to strain under the pressure. The Cowboys were loyal, but they were also practical people with families to support. If Jake's ownership was somehow illegal, their jobs could be at risk. The breakthrough came when Sarah found him in the barn on the third evening, looking exhausted and defeated. I've been thinking about what your father told me before he left, she said without preamble. Jake looked up from the horse he'd been mindlessly grooming. What did he say? He said that sometimes the only way to protect what's important is to fight dirty against people who don't play by the rules. Sarah sat down on a hay bale, her expression serious. He also said that he'd hidden some insurance, just in case the Blackwood family ever tried to rewrite history. What kind of insurance? Sarah pulled a small key from her pocket. Your father left a safety deposit box at the bank in town. He told me to give you this key if anyone ever questioned his partnership in the ranch or tried to claim it was illegitimate. Jake stared at the key, feeling a spark of hope for the first time in 3 days. You've had this for 20 years? Your father made me promise to keep it secret unless you needed it. He said there were documents in that box that would set the record straight about what really happened between him and Eleanor's husband. The next morning, Jake drove to town with Eleanor and Sarah, leaving Roy to keep an eye on the auditors. The safety deposit box was in the basement of the First National Bank, a small room that smelled of metal and old paper. The box contained documents that told a story Jake had never known. Letters between his father and Eleanor's husband revealing a partnership that went much deeper than Jake had realized. Financial records showing that Thomas Morrison had actually loaned money to the ranch during a difficult period in the early 1980s. And, most importantly, a written agreement signed by Eleanor's husband acknowledging that Thomas Morrison had earned his partnership through more than just investment. But, the most damaging document was a letter from Eleanor's husband to his nephews, written shortly before his death. In it, he specifically stated that they would never inherit control of the ranch because they lacked the character and commitment necessary to preserve what he and Eleanor had built. Eleanor read the letter with tears in her eyes. I never knew he'd written this. He must have hidden it because he knew what his nephews would do if they found it. Jake studied the documents, seeing not just legal protection but the full story of his father's relationship with the Blackwood family. Thomas Morrison hadn't been just a ranch hand who got lucky. He'd been a partner who'd helped save the ranch during its darkest period and earned his ownership stake through sacrifice and hard work. When they returned to the ranch, Stevens and the Blackwood nephews were waiting with expressions of barely contained triumph. Richard stepped forward with another legal document. "We've completed our audit," he announced. "And we've found enough irregularities to petition the court for immediate suspension of Mr. Morrison's partnership agreement pending a full investigation." Jake handed the lawyer the documents from the safety deposit box. "I think you should read these before you file any more legal papers." Stephen's confidence evaporated as he read through the documents. His face went pale, then flushed red with anger. "Where did you get these?" "They've been in safekeeping for 20 years, Eleanor said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who just played a winning hand. Waiting for the day when someone tried to rewrite history. Richard snatched the documents from the lawyer's hands, his face contorting with rage as he read his uncle's final letter. "This is impossible. Uncle William would never have written this." "Your uncle wrote that letter because he knew exactly what kind of men you are," Eleanor said coldly. "He built this ranch to last for generations, not to be sold off in pieces by people who care more about quick profits than lasting value." David Blackwood stepped forward, his voice shaking with anger. "This isn't over. We'll contest these documents. We'll prove they're forgeries." Jake felt the strength that came from finally knowing the whole truth about his father and his place on the ranch. "You're welcome to try. But, in the meantime, I think you should leave my property." The words hung in the air with the weight of absolute authority. Richard and David Blackwood realized that they were no longer dealing with an uncertain drifter who could be intimidated. They were facing a man who knew his rights and had the documents to prove them. Stevens gathered his papers and briefcase, his professional composure cracking. "This matter will be resolved in court, Mr. Morrison." "I look forward to it," Jake replied calmly. As the Mercedes disappeared down the ranch road, Eleanor put her hand on Jake's arm. "Your father would be proud of how you handled that." Jake looked out over the vast expanse of the Blackwood Ranch, seeing not just cattle and grass but a legacy that stretched back generations and forward into a future he would help shape. "I finally understand why he left," Jake said. "He knew that someday I'd need to come back and finish what he started." 6 months later, the court case was settled in Jake's favor, with the judge ruling that the Blackwood nephews had no legal claim to the ranch and ordering them to pay Jake's legal fees. Eleanor had begun the process of gradually transferring more operational control to Jake, preparing him for the day when he would inherit the full responsibility of the ranch. Standing on the front porch of the main house as the sun set over land that was now truly his, Jake Morrison understood that he'd found more than just an inheritance. He'd found his purpose, his family, and the place where his father's dreams would finally become reality. Eleanor joined him on the porch, moving more slowly than she had a year ago but still carrying herself with the dignity of someone who'd fought for everything she'd ever achieved. "So," she said, settling into the chair beside him. "Ready to carry on the family tradition?" Jake smiled, thinking about the generations of cattlemen who'd worked this land and the future generations who would continue their work. "I think I'm finally ready for whatever comes next." In the distance, Roy was bringing the horses in for the night, and Sarah was checking on the cattle in the near pasture. The ranch was settling into its evening rhythm, the eternal cycle of work and rest that defined life on the land. Jake Morrison had found his place in that cycle, carrying forward his father's vision while building something new for the future. The drifter had finally come home.